In this video, we're going to continue our discussion about gradients. And I know we talked about them fairly extensively in the previous video, but understanding gradients and how and why things move are significantly important. So a couple things to reiterate. Things move from high to low. Things are ions or molecules within the body. They move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Specifically, I should be saying an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration. Another thing I want to highlight that we also talked about is that when things move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, it is a passive process. It does not require energy. One thing I do want to highlight within the realm of diffusion is that there is a limitation to how far things can diffuse. Ions and molecules can diffuse for a very, very short distance. And when I say very short distance, that is from our perspective. On the molecular or cellular perspective, it's a decent distance, but a molecule of glucose cannot travel, say, from the heart all the way up to the brain or all the way down to the big toe simply via diffusion. There is a limit to how far things can diffuse. That is why we have our circulatory system where blood can actually carry things very long distances. But once they get to where they need to be, in this example, glucose will leave the blood and move into body cells. When it's leaving the bloodstream to move into the body cells, it is diffusing out of the bloodstream and into the body cells. If we look at insulin, which is released from the beta cells of the pancreas, I know we have yet to talk about that. Don't worry about it. But insulin is released from specialized cells in the pancreas known as beta cells. Insulin leaves the beta cells via diffusion. It leaves from an area of high concentration within specific structures known as secretory vesicles within the beta cells. And when that door is open, insulin diffuses down their chemical gradients into the bloodstream. And we'll talk about that in detail in another video. One thing I just mentioned was a chemical gradient. And there are two types of gradients we will reference: chemical gradients and electrical gradients. Chemical gradients are nothing more than we've been talking about the last few lectures. Sodium is a chemical, potassium is a chemical, glucose is a chemical. Whatever entity in question we are referring to that is diffusing is the chemical. And it has a gradient, or I shouldn't say it has a gradient, it may have a chemical gradient where there is a region of higher concentration and a region of lower concentration. And there also can exist electrical gradients. And this refers to the change in voltage between the inside and the outside of the cell, and we are going to highlight that. But just to reiterate, diffusion is passive. It's like this ball rolling downhill. No energy is required for that ball to roll downhill. But if we want that ball to roll uphill, energy is required. And that is what's known as an active process. It requires energy or work, generally in the form of ATP when our body is doing work. We will detail that at length in a later video. But I just want to reiterate, diffusion is like a ball rolling downhill passively. Now, certainly that ball is going to create energy by rolling, but nothing is going to be needed to initiate the roll of the ball rolling downhill. Okay, so let's take a look at this body cell right here. And this is typical for all cells in the human body, or nearly all cells in the human body, where we see a much higher concentration of sodium outside of cells than inside of cells. Throughout our body, our extracellular fluid, our interstitial fluid, our blood plasma has a much higher concentration of the sodium ion than the inside of our cell does. And we can just say this is standard throughout our whole body, because it absolutely is. As a result, sodium is going to want, and I put quotes around that word want because there's no forethought or intention within the ion sodium, but like all chemicals, ions, molecules within the body, they get bounced around and they tend to move, or they do move, to areas of lower concentration. And this area of lower concentration is in the cell. Sodium would prefer or be incentivized to move into the cell because there's a smaller concentration of sodium in the cell. One caveat to this is that sodium requires a channel, and that's what this purple thing is right here. Sodium requires a channel to enter cells, and that is because sodium has a positive charge. We have talked about that the plasma membrane or cell membrane is selectively permeable. It lets some things in and not others. There are certain things like lipid-based molecules that can pass through that plasma membrane unaided without a channel. But any polar molecule, such as glucose, or ions which are charged, like sodium or potassium or chloride, which is an anion, negatively charged, all of these things require channels. And we will elaborate on these channels in a subsequent video. But I just want to be clear, that's what this purple thing is, and sodium, and subsequently, and potassium as well, which we'll look at, require channels. As long as that channel is open and available to sodium, sodium is going to move down its chemical gradient into the cell. That is a passive process. Nothing needs to happen for sodium to move into the cell other than a route or avenue or channel through which it can pass. Now let's look at potassium. As we can see, potassium has that channel we talked about. Potassium always maintains a much higher concentration within cells than outside of cells. The intracellular fluid of cells, the cytosol, has a much higher concentration of potassium than the interstitial fluid and extracellular fluid. Potassium always has a gradient, a chemical gradient, favoring it to leave cells. It will diffuse out of cells as long as that channel is present. Once again, potassium is a cation. It's a positively charged atom that cannot cross a plasma membrane without the channel, and that's because of its charge. Potassium moves passively out of cells from an area of high concentration inside the cell to an area of lower concentration outside of the cell. So those are the chemical gradients specific to sodium and potassium, and by and large, they're not going to change. There are some very small select areas of the body where these gradients are inversed, but for the most part, we can just remember high concentration of sodium outside of cells, high concentration of potassium inside of cells. Okay, now let's talk about how a cell has a charge or voltage. The voltage is merely a difference in charge between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell. The inside of the cell has some protein anions and some phosphate ions that imparts a negative charge inside of the cell, and it's more positive outside the cell. More negative inside body cells, more positive outside. And when I say more positive outside, I'm really referring to just immediately on the outside of that plasma membrane. And this difference in charge between the outside of the cell and the inside of the cell is known as a voltage. Just like a battery. A battery has a voltage because on one end there's a negative charge, and on the other end is a positive charge, an anode and a cathode. So it's similar to a battery. The voltage within body cells is generally negative 70 to negative 90 millivolts. And we'll talk about that when we talk about excitable cells. But this voltage impacts the movement of ions into or out of cells. What I want you to remember from chemistry is like charges repel each other. two positive charges prefer to stay away from each other. Two negative charges prefer to stay away from each other. But opposite charges, such as the charge on the sodium ion and the chloride, the negative charge on the chloride ion, are attracted to each other, and that's where we get sodium chloride. So like charges repel each other, opposite charges are attracted to each other. With that in mind, let's take a look at sodium again and at sodium's gradients. So we've already established that sodium has a chemical gradient favoring it to move into the cell. But it also has what we refer to as an electrical gradient favoring it to move into cells. And the electrical gradient is merely the positive charge of sodium. Sodium overall is positive, but the positive sodium being attracted to the negative of the interior of the cell. And that is sodium's electrical gradient. The cation sodium is attracted to the negativity of the inside of the cell. So sodium is incentivized two ways to move into the cell. By its chemical gradient, moving from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration inside the cell, but also its electrical gradient. The fact that it's positive, the interior of the cell is negative. And that is what we refer to specifically with sodium and with any other cation outside of cells as an electrochemical gradient. It has two gradients favoring it to move into the cell. Electrical and chemical for sodium, an electrochemical gradient. Now, what do we think is going to happen with potassium? As I'm writing this out, drawing this out, this cell has a positive charge on the outside, a negative charge on the inside. Where is potassium's electrical gradient? That is to say, is potassium incentivized to leave a cell based on its electrical gradient? Just quick review, we've already said potassium is going to leave a cell down its chemical gradient. It's going to diffuse out of the cell from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration. That is its chemical gradient. But based on charge alone, would potassium want to leave the cell? The answer to that is absolutely not, because potassium is positively charged. The outside of the cell is positively charged. Opposite charges repel each other. So based on charge alone, potassium would not want to leave the cell. It does leave the cell because its chemical gradient is so large, so huge, it disregards the fact that it has no desire to be around the positivity outside of the cell. Now, there is a point where the cell becomes so positive on the outside or so negative on the inside that potassium actually decides not to leave the cell. And once again, decides the wrong word, but potassium does not leave the cell any longer. Please keep in mind, if we're basing this just on charge alone and not potassium's chemical gradient, potassium wouldn't leave the cell because potassium, it's positive, would prefer to be around the negativity within the cell, around the negative 70 to negative 90 millivolts within the cell. But we cannot disregard the chemical gradient because it's huge and it plays a very big part of the cellular environment. Okay, so in conclusion, sodium has an electrochemical gradient. Potassium only has a chemical gradient. And I want to restate that. Potassium does have an electrical gradient. It's wrong for me to say it does not have an electrical gradient. But potassium's electrical gradients would favor it to stay in the cell. It would not favor it to leave the cell. So as far as the movement of potassium, it only has a chemical gradient favoring it to leave the cell, whereas sodium has an electrochemical gradient favoring it to enter the cells.